In 1925, Winston Churchill, then Chancellor of the Exchequer, returned Britain to the gold standard at the pre-war exchange rate. It was a mistake that was eventually to discredit the very idea of a gold standard, and it produced unemployment in Britain, whereas most other industrial countries enjoyed a boom in the 1920s. Churchill's decision to return to gold at the old parity overvalued the pound and made British goods too expensive for foreigners. In The Economic Consequences of Mr. Churchill, a pamphlet of 1925, Keynes argued that the only way to make gold at the old parity stick was to force prices down by a policy of dear money or high interest rates. The inevitable consequence was unemployment and the general strike of 1926.
But those few stolen hours were soon swallowed up as the exchange was closed on Monday and Tuesday.
Britain was forced off the gold standard in 1931 against a background of world monetary disorder, the great crash of 1929 in America, and mounting protectionism everywhere. Keynes was not the only critic of the gold standard, but his influence was a factor in its eventual dethronement.
We must free ourselves from the bondage of old ideas. There are high authorities who, though they recognize the impossibility of restoring the old gold standard, would like to get us back as near to it as they can. This is not what we ought to be thinking. We ought to fix the future value of our money on foreign markets so as to be stable and at the same time in right adjustment with our wages, our national debt, and so forth. It is a wonderful thing for our businessmen and our manufacturers and our unemployed to taste hope again. But they must not allow anyone to put them back in the gold cage where they have been pining their hearts out all these years.
All through the 1920s, Keynes had been engaged on a major academic work which became the Treatise on Money, published in 1930. It was Keynes's first attempt at a detailed analysis of the changes in the general level of prices. In this effort, he largely accepted and built on the orthodox quantity theory of money, developing the insights of his Cambridge mentor, Alfred Marshall, one of the great economists of the Victorian era, whose magisterial principles of economics provided 2 generations of English economists with a veritable Bible of economic truths. The Treatise on Money was brutally reviewed. It was criticized on purely technical grounds, but also because it analyzed business cycles largely in terms of prices. Within a year, Keynes decided to work on a new book, which was to become 5 years later The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, the book for which he's now best remembered. In the early 1930s, unemployment rose all over the industrialized world and seemed to become a permanent feature of the economic landscape. It was against this background of persistent unemployment that Keynes developed his new general theory. This time the focus of analysis was not prices, as in the Treatise on Money, but output, real income, and the total volume of employment in an economy. Keynes spent almost 5 years circulating various drafts of the general theory around Cambridge, receiving numerous comments and suggestions. This book was thoroughly rehearsed before publication. In January 1935, Keynes wrote to George Bernard Shaw, "I believe myself to be writing a book on economic theory which will largely revolutionize, not I suppose at once, but in the course of the next 10 years, the way the world thinks about economic problems." The orthodox view that Keynes now challenged assumed that the economy works on an autopilot, so that if it is jolted off course by shocks to the system, resulting in depression and unemployment, it soon recovers its equilibrium, thus restoring full employment. Keynes rejected this orthodox belief and replaced it by an explanation of unemployment as a normal characteristic of a capitalist economy, adding that only public works financed by borrowing rather than taxes can succeed in generating full employment. As the experience of the American New Deal showed, Contemporary economists were prepared to tolerate such programs, but only on a temporary basis. The British Treasury believed as a matter of dogma that major public works like those of President Roosevelt in America destroy as much employment as they create. Keynes categorically denied this Treasury view, as it was called, and claimed that unemployment could only be eradicated by deliberate government action. Now here is the originality and excitement of Keynes's approach. Previously it had only been cranks and Marxists who said that the economy lacked an effective autopilot. But these people were not taken seriously by the economic establishment. But for someone like Keynes to cast doubt on the idea that the economy had an autopilot was truly revolutionary. Because saving and investment is done by different people for different reasons, there's no guarantee that the two will be the same. What then brings them into harmony, or as economists love to say, into equilibrium? If savings are larger than investment, this depresses the rate of interest, and that automatically lowers saving and raises investment until the two are equal. It works just as well the other way round when investment is bigger than savings. But instead, Keynes argued, it is variations in income itself that bring savings into equilibrium with investment. And moreover, it is investment that is always the active partner in the relationship. When investment goes up, this causes a multiplied increase in income. That makes consumption go up, but never by as much as income. And that difference in turn generates the savings to match the initial increase in investment. What we have here are a few highly interrelated ideas developed by Keynes. The consumption function, the multiplier, and a particular way of thinking about saving and investment. A mature student at the London School of Economics by the name of Bill Phillips was actually inspired by these Keynesian ideas to build a hydraulic machine to depict the working of the British economy. And this is what it is, a hydraulic machine depicting the workings of the British economy along Keynesian lines. It is in fact an analog computer built in 1948, long before modern electronic computers. But it was actually used for teaching purposes at LSE, Cambridge, Harvard, and elsewhere, all through the 1950s. About a dozen of these machines were built in accordance with Phillips's instructions. What this machine demonstrates is the circular flow of income and the role that saving and investment play in determining the size of that circular flow. Consumption, investment, and saving form a circular flow in which business firms pay out wages, rents, and interest to households to produce goods and services, and households pay out money to business firms to buy goods and services. Business firms cannot expect their sales to consumers to be as large as the total of their outgoings, because the public will want to save some of its income. These savings therefore leak out of the circular flow. That doesn't matter, provided that businessmen are at the same time injecting a sufficient amount of additional payment for new investment. The total amount of income flowing around the circular flow will go up when businessmen try to invest more than consumers are saving, and it will go down when consumers try to save more than businessmen are investing. Keynes introduced the so-called consumption function, an absolutely central concept in his thinking. If you plot consumer expenditure against disposable income, you discover, lo and behold, that total consumer expenditure in any given year is a stable and highly predictable fraction of national income. It's always about 3/4 to 4/5 of disposable income. Suppose that, for whatever reason, investment increases by £100. Somewhere a business firm hires extra workers to the tune of £100. According to Keynes's consumption function, our workers will spend 3/4 of the extra £100 of income, or £75, on consumption, and they will save the rest. But the effect doesn't stop there. We now introduce Keynes's concept of the multiplier, namely that any increase in investment will have a multiplied effect on income. If our workers spend the £75 of their extra £100 to buy groceries, the grocers spend 3/4 of the £75 they receive on food for themselves and on new orders from their wholesalers. And these wholesalers, in turn, spend 3/4 of their extra income, leading to an ever-dwindling series of consumption, spending, and respending. The amazing thing is that this dwindling series does not go on forever. It adds up to a very definite number. If the workers spend 3/4 on consumption, the multiplier is 4. If they'd spent 4/5, the multiplier would have been 5. If they'd spent 7/8, the multiplier would have been 8. In other words, the greater the fraction of extra income spent on consumption respending, the greater is the multiplier effect of new private investment. The whole argument works just as well on public investment, say on money spent by governments on public work programs. What Keynes is saying is that the value of the multiplier is always greater than 1. And if this is so, it must be true that any amount of unemployment can be cured, at least in principle, by a sufficiently large increase in public spending, whatever the source of that spending. I wonder if you realize how extraordinary this is. Economists have been debating the pros and cons of public works in depressions for over a century without coming to any definite conclusion. We've just spent 5 minutes expounding the simplified Keynesian theory of income determination. And we've shown, I hope conclusively, that a given amount of private or public spending is capable of raising national income by at least as much, and perhaps by even more. And in this way, can eliminate any amount of unemployment. That is the central message that Keynes brought to economics. I went to Yale University in New Haven, Connecticut, and spoke to Professor James Tobin, whose work in the Keynesian spirit earned him a Nobel Prize in economics. Keynes's general theory was practically the first book that he'd ever read in economics.
Why did it make such an impression on a 19-year-old in 1936? Well, because anybody who was alert to world problems was distressed by the economic and political problems of the day and the apparent inability of anybody to do anything about them. And along came a book that logically said what to do, what could be done. It wasn't hopeless. And it also said so in a way that was exciting to a student who was mathematically, theoretically, quantitatively inclined. And you like theoretical controversy when you're that age, and you like the good guys and the bad guys, and you side with the forces of new thought against the encrusted orthodoxy. And I didn't know much about the encrusted orthodoxy, but it appealed to me that I could join the revolt against it.
At MIT in Cambridge, Massachusetts, there's another Nobel Prize winner, Professor Paul Samuelson. His textbook, Economics, was almost the first post-war textbook to introduce Keynesian economics to first-year students.
I was still 20 when the general theory came out, but I had a very early education. I was precocious, and I was at the University of Chicago, the inner temple of classical economics. So unlike my friend Jim Tobin, who always says that he didn't know any better but to be a Keynesian because he started just after Keynes arrived, I know what it was like before, and I know what it was like after, and it was because the old theory had no handle at all to explain what was happening in London, in New York, Main Street, Iowa, in the years 1930 to 1936, that there was a tremendous opening here, and it was Keynes who magnificently made a beginning in filling that opening.
Keynes's theorizing has not always impressed everyone. One economist has said that Keynes had a poet's intuition and a practical man's grasp, but that he did not know how to theorize rigorously, an astonishing thing to say about a great thinker. The man who said that was Frank Hahn, now professor at Keynes's old university, Cambridge.
That he was not rigorous in his theorizing, it's simply a consequence of the fact that I think he wasn't too much interested in economic theory. His teacher was Marshall, and Marshall was the man who, as it were, produced the dominant theory of the market economy, not only for England but for the Western world of that period. He's codified, a great deal had gone before, but he was a dominant influence. Keynes never liberated himself from what he had learned from Marshall, and yet what he had to say in the book was plain opposite to what Marshall had to say. And that is why the book, when it appeared, was reviewed in a very hostile manner by Pigou.
There's no disagreement that Keynes had an enormous impact on economic theory, on economic policy, and on the general climate of social and political thought following World War II. But there is disagreement on precisely what he meant to say in the general theory.
The central message of the general theory is pretty clear, I think. It's given in the first part of the general theory. It is that you can't rely on the free market to maintain full employment equilibrium. The self-recuperative or the self-adjusting features of the system are too weak to do that. And contrary to the neoclassical belief that any time a market's out of balance, then price movements will put it back into equality of supply and demand. And Keynes comes along and says that may be true of the fish market or the market for rice or something, but it's not true of the national or international market for goods and services in total or for labor.
The central message was that he took the level of unemployment and the level of aggregate output as a variable to be explained, whereas the schoolman who taught me really had a theory that the only unemployment possible was a zero rate of unemployment, because a classical system can always find its equilibrium where everybody who really wants a job will be able to find one.